Hi, everybody. I'm Noor. I'm one of the security consultants at SmartTech. I work closely with organizations of all different shapes and sizes and industries, helping them strengthen their compliance and risk posture, particularly around frameworks like ISO 27001, helping them sort of translate governance requirements into practical, measurable security. And that's through using our experience in battle-tested methodologies to achieve solid compliance outcomes. I'm really excited to be here today. Joining me on this call, I've got my colleagues Aaron as well as Nirali, both specialist GRC consultants. Aaron, Nirali, could you maybe say a few words to sort of, introduce yourselves, please?
Sure. Hi there, everybody. My name is Aaron Smith. I am the Director of Information Security Consulting here at SmartTech, and I am happy to talk to you today.
Hi everyone, I'm Nirali, a GRC security analyst at SmartTech. And yes, I'm looking forward to share my experience on ISO 27001 expertise.
Perfect. I'm happy to have you both here today. Um, I think just to kick things off, I mean, one thing I'd like to really sort of discuss is one sort of observation that I've made through sort of speaking to a lot of sort of companies out there. And what I tend to sort of see is that a lot of companies that I speak to, they tend to sort of confuse ISO 27001 compliance with actual sort of security maturity, you know? And as we all know, like the two are not the same. Aaron, could you maybe sort of say a few words and give us like your observations around that and maybe like what you've seen like with customers that you've been working with?
Absolutely. So this is a really common problem, and it's one of those things that I find is almost universal across the world, regardless of industry vertical, regardless of the standard, actually. But 27001, NIST2 are both great examples of places where there's a nice framework that provides organizations with an understanding of what they need to have in place from a tools, technology, and governance perspective. It ensures that things are risk-based. It ensures that you've got proper processes and you're trying to improve. But it's important to understand that the cybersecurity tooling itself and sort of cybersecurity maturity are really quite a bit separate. One of the things that's true about the vast majority of these frameworks, and 27001 is no different. NIST2 is another really great example of this. And even Cyfun is a great example of this, where the standard itself really just ensures a couple of different things. It ensures that you have the product in place, that it is functional, that you are able to prove that with evidence, and that it's constantly improving, right? And it's risk-based.
Mhm.
All of those things are in place. What it doesn't ever measure is how successful those tools are and how mature those tools are. Um, it's important to understand that just because you're not particularly mature in a certain space or domain doesn't mean that you won't get ISO certified as well, right? As long as you have the tools in place and you're working on getting better, you still are going to be okay from an ISO perspective. As long as the majority of those tools are in place and the controls are the minimal controls are there, you're going to pass your certification. Now, going from that to, is the tool being leveraged in the best possible way to improve our security? Those are pretty different things. One of the things that's nice about ISO 27001, though, is it has a really nice understanding of what it takes to constantly be improving. So it puts processes around that. And it ensures that at the very least, you're coming back periodically to look at those individual tools and test and validate their level of maturity. You will end up doing a lot of maturity work as a part of maintaining ISO 27001 in your organization, but the two really shouldn't be confused with one another. It is possible to have a really robust, mature cybersecurity stance and still not be ISO compliant, and vice versa.
Could you maybe just give
Does
us
that
like
answer the question for you?
no, no,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. I was wondering if you could maybe give us like a specific example. Like, I mean, obviously, like for confidentiality reasons, like without naming any sort of names.
right.
But like, could you maybe help us understand, like, in kind of like real life terms, like maybe like I don't know, like a scenario where an organization was actually fully certified, fully sort of compliant with ISO 27001, on paper, I guess. But they were still like materially like insecure. Like, could you maybe help us understand like what failed, like what wasn't up to par?
Absolutely. So this is really common with a lot of different organizations. And a
Mhm.
great example is organizations and their data security, right? Data security is something that ISO wants you to have in place, and it wants to see that those tools are in place.
Mhm.
But data security maturity, as anybody who's worked in the consulting space knows, is a really challenging ladder to climb. And a lot of organizations just aren't there. They may have a tool in place. They may have, for example, DLP or DSPM in place. They may be doing that work, but really leveraging it to a degree that the tool is constantly improving is a completely different thing. I have seen plenty of examples of organizations that they have purchased DLP as a part of their requirements. They have it in place as showing evidence of control over their data, right? The problem is it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the right policies in place or that they're using the tool to the extent that their organization needs it. One of the most common examples of this that I have seen is that organizations with DLP tooling in particular, I'm going to use it because it's a very easy example. They will put the tool in place and it'll tend to be something like an endpoint tool, but it isn't always checking the most common vectors. And the most common vector, let's be honest, for any kind of in and out in every organization is email, right? Unless that DLP is being applied there as well, they're really not improving their security stance anywhere near to what they could be with that product.
Got it. Perfect. Thanks for the example. And also, I guess, like, just sort of understanding a bit more about, ISO 27001 and how it's supposed to work. From your experience, like, where would you say like ISO 27001, I mean, isn't sort of particularly good at? Like, I mean, are there areas that it doesn't sort of particularly sort of cover, or and if so, like, where would you feel like what do you feel like a company should do to sort of compensate for those gaps?
Okay, so this is a really important point. And it's one of those things that I find is a challenge for a lot of organizations when they tackle ISO.
Mhm.
ISO has so many standards and it has so many parts that it's very easy for ISO processes and procedures to become a huge part of what people do. It begins to take over portions of their process, right? And because of that, organizations that are trying to develop it or to implement it in their org, really often they will be doing all the motions, but not materially improving. So one of the things that's important to understand about ISO 27001 is it is a very flexible standard, and it's meant for orgs of every different size and every different industry. Because of that, there's huge portions of the standard that aren't always applicable to every organization. And I've seen organizations struggle to understand what's really applicable to them and what they need to have. And if something isn't applicable to them, how to explain that it isn't applicable to them to an auditor and write it out of their statement of applicability. How to go through that process and ensure that they're not damaging business process by implementing ISO 27001. One of the things that I think ISO does a great job of is showing you all the different controls and all the different ways in which you can improve your org and build really a base standard for how everything in information security should be done. It's wonderful about that. It's very, very robust. The problem is sometimes it's a little too robust, right? It's so robust that it brings in elements that aren't necessary for a lot of different organizations. And many organizations will get wrapped around the axle in trying to comply to things that aren't necessary within their organization. They don't know where they can expand or contract in their use of the standard in a way that's both compliant and will improve their business processes.
No,
Does that make
thank you for
sense?
that. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And
Yeah,
Nirali, on your side, from your experience, I mean, like, from like an audit perspective, I mean, where do you sort of tend to see auditors sort of probing the most? Like, could you maybe sort of give us a bit of insight there?
Yeah, so nowadays I experience that auditors not only just see the documentation perspectives, but they go more deeply apart from the documentation. That is, they check the control effectiveness.
Mm.
For example, I would consider the risk treatment decisions. Most of the organizations just build the risk register template and they define the treatment plans, whether to mitigate the risk or accept the risk, but without any justification. So that raises a red flag for the auditors.
Mm.
That
Got
why
it.
the justification has not been mentioned. Who approved the risk? What are the treatment plans? When is the next review date coming up? So this is the depth the auditors look for. Another example, it would be to check the control effectiveness over time. We say organization mostly say that they do have a controls in place. For example, in access policy documentation, you mentioned that you do access review on a monthly or quarterly basis, but there are no evidence proof of that because the organization sometimes do the manual process of access review by keeping a access review template in Excel or Word,
Mm.
or by the tools as well. So the evidence maintenance is not traceable. There are no records of evidence to show it to the auditors. So again, the auditors have more questions in depth related to that. So that raises a control ineffectiveness for the auditors and also the evidence of monitoring and review. For example, consider you do a pen testing once in an year or vulnerability scanning on a quarterly basis. You do have a reports of that. But what about the tracking or remediation plans for the high or critical vulnerabilities you find out?
Are there any best practices that you maybe like you recommend to sort of, around that? Or
Yeah, so the best practice is you should have a control effectiveness. You should keep tracking of the logs
yeah,
on a periodic basis. You should have an ownership of each and every control. You should define the frequency of that. You should keep a recurring calendar invites within the organization so that during the audit period the team would not panic and they can confidently ha- handle during the audit and can show the proof that we are secure, we are doing the controls in place on a periodic basis.
got it. Thank you for that, Nirali. And another question for yourself, Aaron. I mean, if I may, I mean, from your sort of experience and like with what you're seeing now, I mean, how does sort of ISO 27001, like how does it, I mean, do you feel that it struggles to keep up with like more like modern kind of like threats, specifically like I don't know, like supply chain threats or like ransomware? I mean, how do you feel like ISO 27001 kind of like copes with those kind of like threats?
So ISO is an interesting example of this. The standard is so large that
Mhm.
changing it takes quite a bit of effort, right? And the process by which they change it takes quite a bit of effort. Um, the most recent version did a great job in 2022 of extending ISO into brand new places that it wasn't before.
Mhm.
I do think the standard is challenged to continue to grow quickly. We all know the space is changing very, very fast, right? And there are a lot of things that aren't quite covered by the standard yet that are becoming common or even best practice. So there are some places where ISO struggles to kind of keep up. The truth is, though, most of the control descriptions within ISO are broad enough to require you to have those controls in place, even for things that aren't necessarily covered. A very good example of this is the requirement to have an understanding of where your data is, how your data is moving, and ensuring that it's being properly controlled and that it's access-based, right? It's based on roles. One of the things that it doesn't necessarily do is directly address AI tools, right? It
Mm.
doesn't always address these things in the way that a lot of organizations would expect it to. But those other requirements will cover that tooling just fine, right? But what it takes is an experienced auditor to understand how those rules apply to new tools that aren't necessarily folded into the standard yet.
No, thanks for sharing that. I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask is a bit more about like the flexibility, and the broadness of ISO. Could that be seen as a weakness, or is that maybe like a strength? I mean, because as you said, I mean, like, could it not be a bit difficult to audit? A standard that's very flexible, that's too flexible, that's too broad. How do you think, those sort of challenges could be sort of, overcome?
So this is a really common problem, right? ISO is a very big, very
Yeah.
broad standard. 27001 is very complex, and it is beautifully designed to cover absolutely everything from, like we said, from tiny organizations to 200,000 people organizations. It's a nice process. It's well designed.
Mm.
It does require expertise to understand how to scale those things within your organization and at what level to scale them. And at what level the responsibilities need to be held. My general recommendation when it comes to getting around that sort of, I don't want to call it a weakness of the standard
Mm.
because it's actually a benefit, right? But I think
Mm.
the best way to voice it is the best way to get around or to understand that challenge is to have experienced people that you're used to working with, to communicate with them about how you feel the standard fits to your organization. Any organization that's just coming in and auditing you very broadly without understanding the context of your organization is already doing you a disservice. Or anyone who's trying to prepare you for ISO certification and they aren't actually building in the processes to ensure that they match your business processes is doing you a disservice. So the best solution to that is to find trustworthy people to work with, both from a consulting perspective to prepare you for those audits and for the audit delivery. Not all auditors are made the same, right? And we would love it to be true, right? We would love it to be true that all auditors behaved in exactly the same way and everybody had the same nuanced definition of things. But things are quite complex. Sometimes when you're delivering evidence to an auditor, it requires somebody who's got a very nuanced understanding, not just of the tooling, but of the standard itself, to help them understand how this meets the requirement. Not all of those auditors are technical experts, so being able to explain to them in a way that they'll understand is a huge part of the effort to perform an audit.
Got it. Perfect. And just to finish off, just one last question, which I think ends this discussion sort of quite nicely. But like, in your sort of opinion, I mean, like, at what point does ISO 27001 become like a real sort of strategic sort of asset, as opposed to, I mean, obviously we've touched on this earlier, but as opposed to just kind of like a compliance kind of exercise. I mean, like, I just, the reason why I want to sort of reiterate, this, because I do feel it's very, very important. I mean, ISO 27001 should be absolutely viewed as a strategic asset and not just a compliance tick box. But could you maybe sort of, talk to that a bit, Aaron?
Absolutely. So ISO is a very interesting standard because it is so broad. A large portion of organizations, when they start their journey for compliance with ISO, what they have a tendency to do is use it as a framework to help understand what they're missing, right? A lot of organizations, they know they're not necessarily mature. They know they may not have all of their controls in place. And when they start that journey for ISO certification, they want to understand what they're missing. They want to understand what pieces of their security process are broken or aren't even there yet. One of the places that I see this most commonly, and this is a very common group of organizations for ISO implementations, is small organizations that have grown to mid-sized very quickly. What happens is you have a small organization, it does very well, it's very successful. And as that business starts to grow, they begin to realize that the sort of point-by-point way in which they did things early on doesn't necessarily scale well. And it doesn't speak to professionalism, right? It doesn't speak to the high standards that the certification will give you, right? So I think a lot of organizations struggle to understand what that process is to get from, hey, we're a small org that grew really quick. How do we professionalize the whole background of our information security process? ISO is a wonderful tool for helping them to understand that and giving them a framework to go through that process. It also, from the beginning, starts by focusing on the risks and objectives and opportunities that their organization sees, right? And how to build everything from those. So it starts, ISO at its very foundations, starts with risks and opportunities, right? It's all about a nice logical flow from what are those risks and what are our opportunities and how are our tools, every single one of them, addressing that. One of the big advantages to this is not just it provides you with a framework to expand your security controls and to understand what a robust security system looks like, but it also professionalizes that process and gives people the confidence that as things change, they have a process in place to continue to adapt. As new technologies come along, as new requirements come along from different customers, they'll have a way to go through that process. They'll be confident and comfortable that they've got a risk-based process so that whenever they go to, say, for example, they want to implement a new tool, their risk assessments and their requirements have told them, we absolutely need a new tool within the environment, and this is what that tool should be. One of the advantages to it is it provides you with an entire history of reasoning that becomes your business case, right? When you take that opportunity to the board or you take that opportunity to executive management, you've got a really robust process to look back on and say, hey, here are the exact risks that we've identified. This is exactly what it looks like. Here's the potential loss. Here's the real damage that we could suffer. And here's exactly how this tool will help us and how we expect to mature over time. ISO provides you with that framework to do all of those processes from the get-go. And that is a huge boon to organizations that aren't sure how to expand and professionalize their cybersecurity space.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you. And Aaron, how can your team sort of help our customers? I mean, could you sort of maybe, talk to that a bit, like in terms of the methodologies that we sort of, we use, and our experience, and our yeah. Could you maybe sort of talk to that a bit?
I want to talk about the process that we go through, because I think that is a real enlightening point to that sort of points to what I was just talking about. One of the very first things that we do in an ISO implementation is we sit down with organizations and we begin to understand everything about them. We build a deep understanding of exactly who their organization is, who the people are, and what the context of that organization is. How broad is it? How large is it? How mature are their processes? Do we need to mature certain things before they go for ISO certification? Or are they okay where they're at as long as they build proper processes around it? It's quite complex. And one of the things that I think some of the automated tools don't do a tremendous job of is explaining to you really where you can and can't apply the standard,
Absolutely.
and how you can adjust it to really serve your business, and to ensure that you're doing it in a safe and secure manner. Those tools are fantastic, I think, for like program management. They help you to build an understanding of sort of what you need to tackle and how much of it you're tackling. They're a good tracker. One of the things they won't do, though, is give you that expertise to understand, and Nirali brought this up wonderfully, exactly how deep an auditor is going to go and what that evidence needs to look like when an auditor steps in. When an auditor looks at certain things, you may look at a tool and say, hey, we've provided the evidence that we're supposed to provide. The tool will validate that, yes, that's the sort of thing that you should need. But there are a ton of instances where a smart auditor will look at it and go, well, this is proof that the tool's in place, but I don't see proof that it's risk-based. I don't see proof that you're validating the tool's effectiveness. I don't see proof that you're periodically checking the tool. And I don't see proof that you've got processes in place to consistently manage that tool and improve it over time. And it's one of those things where I think it's really important to understand the depth to which auditors will go and the complexity of their line of reasoning, right? So that's one of the things that I think we provide from a real perspective. One of the big advantages that we have is we work with such a broad range of organizations. We work with ISO 27001 implementations for organizations everywhere from 25 people to hundreds of thousands of people. It's a really broad standard. And simply because of that, the complexity and the nuance of it can be challenging for a lot of organizations. And unfortunately, it's a little more challenging than a lot of automated tools can handle right now, right? They just don't have that much nuance. And I think they're getting there. I think there'll come a time when that's probably fairly common. But I think at the moment, they still really lack the nuance. And they're also very, very manual. One of the things that we do across an organization after developing an understanding of that org is we build policies that suit their organization from the ground up. We go through them with those policies, ensure that everything is properly evidenced. Throughout the process, we will walk through and give them an educational brief on every single part of ISO, and we'll explain to them how it applies to them specifically, not just to organizations in general, but to their org and their industry. This is important because some organizations have really unique capacities or really unusual behaviors. As a good example, biopharma is one of the entities that they tend to have a really unique kind of network behavior. And you have things like researchers that have very unique behaviors within the network, right? So we help them to build standards and processes and policies across that scope that really help to put all of that together for them. It's a service that I don't think any of the automated tools do yet. I think maybe one day they'll get there, but at the moment, you really need experienced people who have seen this been implemented in numerous organizations and can talk to you about where you're going to struggle and how they can help you to not struggle across those pieces.
No, absolutely. I can definitely see how that's useful. I mean, I guess like one of the key differences is how tailored our solution is, like how what we offer compared to the like the manual sort of automated solutions that you get online. How we're sort of very sort of tailored specific to to the customer and their industry. Because we really understand the challenges that they sort of face in that sort of that specific sort of industry through our work. But yeah, no, that was greatly put. Thank you for that, Aaron.
Absolutely. And as an organization, we are deeply customer centric. And I think our methodology for 27001 implementation is a prime example of how customer centric we are. Everything that we do across that process is designed to make that process as easy for you as possible. And it's designed to make it as little a lift as humanly possible. Now, that being said, ISO 27001 is no small lift, right? It is a very big, complex standard. But we do an enormous amount to take that weight off of people's shoulders and to give them the confidence that when they're done, they can step into that audit and absolutely know that they're going to pass.
Perfect. Thank you. Nirali, just before we wrap up, did you have any sort of observations on your side? Anything that you want to sort of add, or?
No, I will be just make it short. Most of the organization looks for a compliance tool, but it's not necessary that every organization can afford the compliance tool. The ISO 27001 can also be done with a manual process by keeping the register, templates, checklist, documentations all into a one source of truth, whatever the companies are using it. So yeah, if the organization can do the control effectiveness on a periodic basis, then the manual process is also not difficult.
Fantastic, brilliant. Yep. So I've really enjoyed this session. Really enjoyed sort of speaking to the two of you, and thank you very much for for being here with me. But yeah, fantastic.
Okay, thanks a lot, Noor. Hey, and I want to bring something up. We're going to have some sessions during ZeroCon,
Yeah,
Zero Day Con coming up that are so specific, and I think they would be interesting for folks to take a look at. If you're not familiar with it, check the Smart Tech link in and the Smart Tech page, and you'll see lots of information about Zero Day Con. And there's going to be a lot of compliance conversations there, and I think it'll be really beneficial.
perfect. Thank you.